This episode is sponsored by Active 911, a respected leader in the emergency communication and software field, providing alerting, mapping, and scene resources for over 500,000 first responders worldwide. Now, as you know, I only bring sponsors on this show who are A, coming from an altruistic place, and B, truly bringing solutions to problems. And the origin story of Active 911 begins with volunteer firefighter and tech entrepreneur Joseph Sullivan. After missing a critical call from a dispatch error, Joseph set out to create a solution to ensure that we are not only dispatched on time, but also provide us with resources and information for the call and location. So there are 3 different products under the Active 911 umbrella. The first is Active Alert, a dispatch system integrated into a CAD connection, providing fast, reliable alerting, maps, data, pre-plans, hydrant locations, and even the locations of incoming units and their specialties. The second arm is Active Comms. Now, many of us have experienced problems when it came to communication using our traditional radios, so Active 911 found a way of tapping into the incredible capabilities of modern-day smartphones and integrate that into our communication, providing both increased range and low latency. So to learn more about Active 911 or to try their free trial, go to active911.com. And if you want to hear more about the origin and spectrum of products that they offer, listen to episode 1243 of the Behind the Shield podcast with the creator and founder, Joseph Sullivan. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show combat fighter pilot, commercial pilot, and the man behind the Debrief Advantage, Jeff Bonner. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into the military, the road to becoming a fighter pilot, his missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, teaching in flight school, his powerful transition story, the tenets of leadership, the importance of a debrief, the industrial military complex, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Jeff Bonner. Enjoy. Well, Jeff, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you, James. It's great to be with you.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you this morning?
So I am in Maryland, north of Baltimore, up by the Pennsylvania state line.
Beautiful. That's actually, if I'm not mistaken, Maryland has just announced that they are pursuing the healthier 42-hour work week for their firefighters. So as a statewide mandate. So it's an exciting time for that state, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. There's always evolution going on in the first responder place, and that's something that we definitely take here in Maryland. We're big in trying to tweak our systems so that we're providing best response, not only for the first responders themselves, but of course for the public as well.
Absolutely. Well, I would love to start the very beginning of your timeline. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Yeah, so I was born in Maryland. So I'm privileged to be able to come back to the community more or less that I grew up in. After high school, went to the University of Maryland. Have a brother who is older than I am, so he went prior to me, went out of state to college, but I chose to stay here in Maryland and go to school. And then after I graduated college, went into the Marine Corps and had the privilege of going to flight school and serving as a Marine Corps jet pilot. And through that course, went to deployed in Iraq, and then later in my career had the chance to fly the A-10 and a couple tours in Afghanistan, and then came back to fly in Maryland and fly for commercial airliner, and that's what I do now, as well as go around speaking. But I focus mostly on time spent as an airline captain, and of course all that life story that brings us to today was shaped heavily by my two parents. My dad was a military veteran, a Vietnam veteran, served in the combat engineer. He was a combat engineer in Vietnam. And then my mom, I got a lot of my passion for continuous improvement, which is primarily what I speak on today, and the books that I've written are focused around this idea of how we're better tomorrow. And she was really probably the impetus for driving that. She grew up and worked a long time in the local community college system here in the state of Maryland, and eventually rose through the ranks and went and got her undergraduate degree long after her my brother and I had left, after high school graduation, and then went on to get her master's as well later in life. So she's a real inspiration. So, like most of us, for better or worse, I think I was shaped heavily by my parents, and in my case, I certainly see them both as inspirations in different ways. Probably got a lot of my passion for military service from my father, and my excitement for continuous improvement from my mother.
What did your dad do more recently after the war? What was his profession?
Yeah, so he came back after, again, he was combat engineer, so he got into heavy construction, worked for most of his career in Caterpillar machinery at the local dealership there, and was heavily, still working the heavy construction side of what he was trained to do as a combat engineer.
It's interesting speaking to people from all the conflicts, all the way back to, even I had World War II veterans on here, and then obviously children or grandchildren of those,
sure,
and getting this different perspective, and the homecoming story, for example, of the World War II veterans. Even though it might be slightly romanticized, not everyone had a ticker tape parade. They were welcomed as heroes. They were received well by the country. And I think one of the misnomers of that generation was that they just rolled up their sleeves and got back to work, and we ignored the fact that they had the trauma, that they took into war and then that they brought back from war. Right. But the Vietnam generation, hearing so many of those veterans, their homecoming was completely different. And you talk about, moral injury, organizational betrayal, to volunteer or be sent to a war and then come back with that kind of negative reception forced a lot of that generation just not even talk about it. So what were the stories, if any, that you heard from your father? And then did you see any struggles from his service coming back in such a negative environment?
Yeah, James, I think you really, that's a great summary of my experience with my dad, in that, he was one of those Vietnam veterans that didn't really talk much about his service. The little bits and pieces that he did talk about, it was clear that his reception was not this very, very much not the same reception that I received coming back from any of my tours in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I very much feel like I stand in my generation of post 9/11 veterans. We stand on the shoulders of those, particularly the Vietnam veterans, because so many of our lessons learned about how, as a culture, we treat our veterans was learned through that reception that those Vietnam veterans really did not receive. They did not receive the kind of reception that we deserve, and that was a real important driver for me. That there was I became, after I retired from the military, I became very, very active in the county commission for Veterans Affairs. And in that capacity, I was really able to meet a lot of different veterans, from the conflicts all the way back from World War II veterans that we had locally, all the way through the folks that weren't even born on 9/11, that had already served and had now left military service. So that spectrum of veterans, you really got a clear vision of the different challenges that those veterans are facing. And, of course, many of them go on to continue to serve in areas like the fire service and first responders. And they're a tremendous asset to what they're doing after their military service, to those organizations that they continue to serve with. So that was a real benefit for me personally to serve as the chair of that county commission for Veterans Affairs, because I was able to take my military experience, blend it with those of others that were serving on the commission, and use that to help others inside our community.
I've had Sebastian Junger on a few times, and he talks about the Veterans Town Hall. And I tried to put it to our board of exactly who you're talking about, and I did a presentation to him and then never heard from him again. But it's a shame. But I think it's such a great idea that on, for example, Memorial Day or Veterans Day or whenever it is, that you get members of our military that get to just get on the stage and speak. The positive experience, negative experience, whatever. So the members of the community not only know what our veterans in the past have done for us, but I would argue also to make sure there's a cautionary tale so that we're not sending our children to wars we have no business being in the first place.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And both sides of that coin are tremendously important. One, to make sure that, unlike that Vietnam veteran experience, we are treating our veterans with care and respect and the honor that they've earned through their military service. But then also the other side of the coin that you're talking about there, which is hearing their stories to ensure that we evolve, right? That as a society, we're in a continual place where we're trying to make the experience of military service better for the next generation.
I'm jumping ahead, but this seems like the right place to ask this question. One of the things I ask a lot of the veterans is, when you look at the basic economic fact that there are a lot of organizations that make a lot of money when we are at war, and the parallel I always use is, if you look at drug companies and medical equipment and these kind of things, it's just irrefutable economics that if we have a lot of sick people, those companies make a lot of money.
Yep.
So in that example, where are the checks and balances to making America healthy again? And I would argue post-pandemic, there really hasn't been a genuine push to reduce our obesity rate from, or an overweight and obesity rate from 75% of the country lower,
Right.
for example.
Right.
But in the
Right.
military point of view, if there are these companies that make a lot of money, there are these companies that on both sides are paying for political journeys and careers. Where are the checks and balances to make sure that we only go to war when absolutely necessary? And I think World War II is a good example of that. When you have these kind of strings being pulled where certain companies have a vested interest in our children being sent to war so that they can make a profit.
Right. Yeah. So that the military industrial complex, right? That's been a challenge that we have seen certainly in the nuclear age, right? As the war machine continues to get bigger and the lines blur between public companies that support that machine and the actual execution of the military government folks that are at the pointy end of the spear so much. And I'll tell you, one of the things, I've got a lot of friends. One of the great, I feel so fortunate through my military experience to serve with a lot of diverse groups within the military, right? Not only in the fighter aviation community, both in the Marine Corps and flying the A-10 later with the Air Force, but the the different branches of military service and the different folks, the specialties. Specifically, what I'm thinking of there is this evolution of cyber warfare, right? And that's something that the lines between that military industrial complex are tremendously blurred, because when we talk about cyber warfare, that's a whole of effort community. And I had the opportunity to study, in addition to the development of this debriefing model, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But during my postgraduate work at Harvard, I was able to really do a lot of national security focused work. And one of the things that I studied was how the evolution of the cyber warfare piece marries and is a whole of, not just whole of government effort, but a whole of society effort. Because when we look at tech companies, they have a tremendous capability that the government in cyber warfare really needs to honor and leverage, right? When you look at companies like Microsoft and a lot of the work that these other big tech giants are doing, they play a critical role in aiding the response in that area of cyber warfare. So I think the days of just the military fighting the conflict, I think those days are largely over. We see tech giants like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and those folks evolving right along right along with our capabilities. And I would even argue that the proliferation of autonomous weapon systems, we're going to see that continue, both aviation assets and maritime assets, submarines that are operating autonomously. These are tech companies that are building these weapon systems, and we're really blurring the lines between where a tech company stops becoming a national security asset and where the formal military services pick up.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. It really is. It's ironic. Years ago, I was a stuntman most of my career as well. And I played in the Terminator 2 show. And, when I first did it, we're talking 2000, basically 2001.
Yeah.
And of course, you're just watching this. Oh, this is fictional. And then here we are now with autonomous drones and and robots, and like, oh my god, and it took like 25 years, and now we're living it. And hopefully, those machines. I've had a lot of people in the IT AI space that are saying, well, that's the only difference between that happening and that not happening. Obviously, is the guardrails and that moral compass of the
Right.
people in charge. And I think that goes back to, yes, you need a deterrent, of course, but at what point, does that go from deterrent to now you're going all over the planet, beginning conflicts? And that's a different conversation, I think.
Sure. No, absolutely. And that moral compass of ensuring that as warfare evolves, we're doing so, the morality of warfare needs to still be grounded. The execution of warfare has certainly evolved, and we've seen that, with the precision of our standoff weapon systems, and to your point, the the drones, and we certainly know that Ukraine has really developed that capability and is displaying that on a daily basis in their current conflict with Russia. But more broadly, where I think that we need to be sensitive, both as a government and as a society, is ensuring that the decision making matrix that goes into when we execute force, that logic really needs to ensure that it's evolved, and we get to a place where, just because we can and it's easier to do standoff weapon systems through autonomous shows of force, and we're not exposing pilots or certainly ground troops at the rate that we have, that doesn't make warfare easier, right? I think that, and that's very much to your point about ensuring that we're keeping that moral compass in the calculations. And hey, look, I think it's important to recognize that it's a good thing that technology has evolved, right? And we see this in your world, I'm sure, of firefighting and first responders and the folks that you work with. The technology has evolved to make us more efficient in the areas that we're working, and that's a good thing. The question is, are we using it to actually benefit the services that we're providing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate your perspective on that.
Yeah.
Let's circle back to early life then. What about sports and exercise? What were you playing and doing throughout the school ages?
Yeah, so growing up, as far as formal sports, I was big in soccer. That was a very big thing for me to establish my, reliance on personal development, but also that's where I learned a lot of my lessons about being on a team. Was playing on soccer, and then baseball as well. So probably those two sports dominated my life, and that really, those two sports prepared me well for the athletic requirements of once I got into the Marine Corps, and that's when I really, of course, there are a lot of lessons learned there about serving on a team and being physically fit, and the necessity and the correlation between showing up physically fit and being able to perform, right? And those are lessons that I still take with me every day today, right? The idea of in order to perform both as an aviator and to serve the folks that I work with in a leadership development capacity, right? We have our body that we need to make sure that it is ready to perform. So, but I would say those two sports were dominant in my development: soccer and baseball.
What about career aspirations? Were you already thinking the military when you were in high school, or was there something else you had in mind?
Yeah, so like so many in my military generation, certainly in fighter aviation, Marine Corps, Navy, Marine Corps fighter aviation, especially. There was a little movie called Top Gun. Don't know if you've ever seen it, but that was tremendously influential. Again, with not only me but so many of my generation that served as strike fighter pilots in in my area. So I remember vividly going to see that movie with my dad, and I was in early high school, probably late middle school kind of thing, and that really was, it's one of those where experience you see something that is just bigger than life, and you're like, yep, that's the path that I want to do. And for me, that was very much the role. And I was the guy in high school that, all over my bedroom were pictures of Cold War military airplanes operating off of Navy ships, right? So A6 Intruders, F-14 Tomcats, all of that was all over my wall. And that's really what I wanted to do, is fly jets off of ships. And my path eventually got toward the Marine Corps to do that, which I was tremendously fortunate that that's the way my life developed. But yeah, for me, it was pretty much, I always knew that I wanted to fly jets.
Why the Marine Corps? Yeah, obviously there are other branches that have aviation as well. What led you to that particular branch in the end?
Yeah, so interesting path that led me to the Marine Corps. So I remember when I came into, this is actually a funny, as I reflect on it now, it's not the way that I had. If I had to do it over again, I wouldn't have done it the same way. But I remember at the University of Maryland at a career fair, being there on the mall at the University of Maryland with all these different types of folks out there career wise and recruiters. And I remember I was wearing a Fly Navy t-shirt. And at that point, that's, again, Top Gun. Like that's what I wanted to do. And I remember going to the Navy recruiter, and they were kind of like, yeah, here's our path and this is what it looks like. And I just was going, and we talked for sure. And then I was, coupled down from them was the Marine Corps recruiter. And it was just such a different experience. It was very much like, it wasn't like, it was like, yeah, first of all, that's a real nice shirt or t-shirt you're wearing. We've got some ones that we might recommend that are different than the Fly Navy t-shirts, but really it was the opportunities that the Marine Corps provided beyond the flying. And that's what really sold me this idea of, hey, in our organization, there's a saying I'm sure you've heard before: every Marine a rifleman, every Marine officer a rifle platoon commander. And that is the core essence of what a Marine officer is. And after that, then you're a fighter pilot, or then you're a tank driver, or then you're a cyber warfare officer. But at your core, you are a rifle platoon commander. And that is very much that is unique in my experience. That is very unique across the services. It's the only services where all Marine Corps officers, after officer candidate school, everybody's going to the same first 6-month infantry focused school. And that really shaped my leadership. It shaped my life. And, honestly, as I reflect back on it, other than marrying my wife, that's by far been the best decision that I've made in my life, is going into the Marine Corps and being shaped in that environment. It's just really, it's hard for me to separate where the discipline and experience that I've had in the Marine Corps stops shaping even what I do on a daily basis today. It really had that much of a profound impact on where I was as a young leader in development.
There seems to be a strong parallel between that experience that you had and a lot of the discussions, again, including with Sebastian Junger, about national service. And that doesn't
Sure.
necessarily mean that you have to be in the military. You could serve in a first responder profession. You could volunteer at a school, whatever it is. But
Yes.
that feeling that you are, that you're part of something much bigger than yourself. And I would
Mm-hmm.
imagine maybe some other officer programs, you come in, you kind of slotted in, you haven't done the same things as maybe some of the other men and women that you're commanding, and then there is that disconnect. And we see it in the first responder professions. A lot of people that run up the ladder as fast as they can, and now their decisions are completely detached from the well-being and performance of the men and women on the ground. And I think that something like what the Marine Corps has, or a national service, if you're talking about the entire nation, where
Yes.
all of a sudden it's not Democrats and Republicans, or blacks and whites or whatever. It's like we're Americans. Because when I did my
Mm-hmm.
year, I invested into this country, and alongside me were people of all faiths and colors and walks of life.
Absolutely. And that's an initiative that we've seen different governments experiment with, state governments experiment with, this idea of service programs, and certainly dating back, to the 60s in the Kennedy administration and the Peace Corps and the idea of AmeriCorps that followed on later. But this idea of national service, and I think that's so important. And both you and your viewers, I think, because you're in that service, we're all in this service idea, and the philosophy that extends from that, I think, is so unique and noteworthy. In this idea of, we have committed our life, even if it's for a short period of time while we serve in these areas, to serve something greater than ourselves. And you said it beautifully there. This idea that we are using our God-given talents and our skill set to serve something greater than ourselves. And to learn those lessons, particularly at an early age, high school, early college development, when we're still trying to figure out who the heck we are as humans and what it is we want to do. I just think, and that's something that, again, getting back to that Veterans Commission that I was speaking of earlier, that is something that we really drove, because our veterans, there's an organization out there called The Mission Continues, and it's a nonprofit. But the idea here is that when folks leave military service, they are still, they need to continue to develop and serve something greater than themselves. That's probably the biggest thing that military service provides us. And there's a particular avenue, I'm sure, for you in the fire service. You see a lot of veterans that have left military service and now continue their training and their service in that profession. And any type of first responder, any type of teaching, these type of things, that evolution of continuing to serve something greater than ourselves, it's just tremendously important in how we develop as a society and as we develop as individuals.
That has been an absolute common denominator when I've talked to people about their transition. Obviously, it can be very jarring, especially if you've had a long career. You've got this identity, you've got this tribe, you've got this purpose. And a lot of the veterans, especially, they'll come out and they'll get into finance or real estate, and it's jarring. And then I think a lot of them, thank goodness, have this realization that I'm not really continuing the mission. And even with me leaving the fire service and doing this, the mission has continued, making first responders healthier. And then they in turn are going to help thousands and thousands of people. But when our veterans find something that they feel like they're still making the world better, contributing, even if it's, obviously making money and these other things that we need, but at its core, it's doing something good, whether it's, personal trainer or working for a nonprofit, that seems to make that transition a lot less jarring, because they feel like, again, that through line is the same, even though they're not wearing the uniform anymore.
No, absolutely. And there's a lot of different ways that we know to do that, right? To become involved in our communities and continue to serve that idea of using ourselves for the betterment of others. And that can be continuing to be professionally, right? Like, so for those folks that you're talking about there that go into finance or something other, where maybe the correlation between serving something greater than themselves and just making money is, it's not to say that there's anything bad about just, the idea of financial security and making money, but the idea is, how do we bridge both of these? So, we want both, right? I want a life full of abundance and money and all the good things that can do for us. And I also want a meaningful life of service and contribution. It's not one or the other. And the folks that I work with now, particularly with a lot of the work that I do in this area of helping folks debrief to improve performance, a lot of it is about bridging those two in some way, where we're developing their company and their organization in a way that honors the mission that they are serving the economy with, but yet also developing their employees in such a way where they're growing individually. And a lot of times that growth individually can be done through volunteer work or other, service oriented ways, where we're not just developing their professional skill set, but we're developing them as a human as well. It's tremendously important.
Absolutely. Well, going through the timeline, you enter the Marines. Obviously, you're wanting to get into the aviation side. I would imagine the attrition rate is extremely high. What was it that allowed you to make it all the way through when so many other people around you, weren't able to get to the end of that particular path?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it had to do with really just not ever thinking about a plan B. Really, I was going all in on the idea of being flying jet airplanes off of aircraft carriers and doing that. And I remember the first time I landed on an aircraft carrier, it was a USS John F. Kennedy out in the Atlantic. And I vividly remember having a sense of kind of such high of accomplishment, but then and also, okay, now what? Where are we going? What does the future hold? And at that point, you're early 20s. There's some invincibility going on there. But for me, it was like I wanted to continue to do that, pursue that path, no matter what it took through flight school and the challenges that we developed, because I just had that burning, it was really very much an identity thing for me. And so when things got tough, which they ultimately do, and talking about things get tough, and I'm sure that in the fire service there's a parallel here. But I had the honor of serving as a flight instructor, probably my favorite. Even the combat tours and the operational squadrons, the fighter squadrons were an amazing experience to see the war machine and be able to contribute and serve others on the ground using my skill set as an aviator to help them in what they were doing through close air support. That was a unique experience, but probably one of my favorite experiences was that of being a strike fighter, a flight instructor, training the next generation of fighter pilots in the Navy and Marine Corps. I had the opportunity to do that, and we're teaching how to use the airplane as a weapon system. And the biggest thing that I saw there through that experience was we're training to create challenges. And I think that this gets to where if it's not difficult, as instructors, we're going to turn up the difficulty level until we get to where the student is experiencing adversity. Because it's really what we're trying to develop is, yes, the physical skill set of executing the mission, but really what we're trying to develop at the end of it is we're trying to develop the student's ability to improvise, adapt, and overcome when they're stressed. That and once we kind of get to that level, then that opens up a whole nother area, because now we're developing people who can operate independently in complex environments and still get the mission done. And that's a whole different avenue. So I think I learned that lesson as a flight instructor, but going through it as a student, what got me through was this idea of really not having another option. It was the identity, and it was going to be, I'm just going to do what it takes. And fortunately, I had the core skill set to get through. It wasn't a lack of motivation. The want to was always there. It was just developing the how to.
I want to dive into the training philosophy a little bit. What I've seen in my profession in some departments is a lowering of the bar, and even recruitment at the moment, sadly, and this kind of health revolution, this work week revolution that I was talking to about in the beginning, I think is going to turn that around. So I'm very optimistic about it. But with that, with the risk management and HR and some of these other forces interfering, you end up with a very low training bar and almost like a box checking mentality. Okay, we did that drill once, you're good. Don't drop that out the next time, you're good.
Right.
As I'm sure you can imagine, some of these big catastrophic, emergencies that we respond to, you're deviating a long way from that central skill set.
Sure.
And the training ground really is the place for us to, as you said, be encouraged to make mistakes. It's okay. No one's going to die on the training ground. So don't scream at them and don't give them one chance and, that's it. So what was the kind of mentality, the philosophy of creating an environment that was realistic, that had a high stress element, but also people weren't afraid to fail, to try these different, tactics and strategies?
Right. So that really drives to the culture of fighter aviation and there's one unique thing that I think fighter aviation does at a level that is unusual across not only different organizations in society, but even inside the military. And that is this idea of debriefing. One of the things that we do in fighter aviation is we go very, very, very deep into this idea of we will use what just happened to make us better the next time we see it. And in order to do that, we need to cultivate a culture that we don't go into a debrief looking to point fingers. We don't go into debrief looking to assign blame. We go into debriefing in fighter aviation for one reason and one reason only: to be better tomorrow. That's it. And once everybody kind of buys into that, and I was talking earlier about this idea of a flight instructor, one of the things that we do, yes, we're certainly teaching the hard skill of landing on an aircraft carrier, of air to ground weapons delivery, of a fighter, air combat maneuvering. Yeah, we're teaching those hard skills of actually using the airplane as a weapon. But then we're also teaching the culture that is required for continuous improvement. And that is focused around this idea of debriefing. And that's largely what I spend a lot of my time doing now, is working with organizations, whether it be in athletics or first responders or business, and helping them put together a debriefing strategy that honors where they are in their development, but yet also continues to drive them toward this idea of continuous improvement. And we want to do that in a very structured way. It's important, and I'm sure we'll get into what makes a good debrief and what makes a bad debrief, and all those lessons learned. that I are tremendously important. But one of the biggest ones is this idea of we don't move the bar for competency, right? We recalibrate to achieve that bar, and we see this in so many different areas that the bar does get lowered. But here's the thing, and this is something that I think is unites your world and my world, is that it's a performance driven industry. You can either do it or you can't, right? And so either I can, you can land the airplane or you can't land the airplane. It's a skill set. It's a performance driven type of environment. And certainly my experience now as a commercial airline captain, that's the bar that we're driving to, and that's what we're tested on. And when we go to the simulators, it's okay, we're going to give you an engine failure. Can you land the airplane with an engine failure, or can you not land the airplane with an engine failure? And so it's very important for us not to get drift from a training department program about these are the core skill sets. And I think in the first responder world, particularly in the fire world, this idea of, hey, look, we still need to maintain core competencies, right? These core competencies still are important to being able to effectively serve the public that we're tasked to serve. The question is, how do we continue to develop our people in such a way that even given the pressures of HR and given the pressures of those things that may want us entice us to drive down, lower the bar, I would recommend the challenge, and it's definitely easier said than done, but the challenge is not to lower the bar. The challenge is to train so that we are constructive and we're continually improving toward achieving those hardcore limits that really drive our ability to provide the service that we're tasked to provide.
I see so many examples of false economy in the world. And I think, what you're talking about in my industry, there's been examples where they've removed gyms from fire stations because they don't want anyone, air quotes, getting hurt, rather than realizing that, you're going to roll an ankle, you're going to, rip a bicep once in a while, but overall, you're going to have a fitter, healthier, happier workforce if you have. And I think it's the same with the training. This looks dangerous. This, insurance is going to be higher if you end up doing this kind of training. But what do you think that financial impact will be if you don't facilitate a rescue on a civilian and they die and there's a lawsuit? It's so closed-minded. So a lot of these kind of constricting rules and regulations that you see handcuffing a lot of the first responder professions don't actually even make any sense. They're a very short-term fix, and they miss the long-term cost.
No, absolutely. And I think what we see there is the frustration as that strain occurs, right? We see the operational units still trying to strive to achieve the goals that are required for their service. That tension between the downward pressure of the lawyers say that this is a little too risky, or we're HR doesn't like that the healthcare costs are going up because we're having these type of injuries. That is very much an experience that the military deals with, and I certainly saw as the evolution of the bar moves for where the requirements are, and it's difficult to say precisely where technology plays into that. I'll give you a great example. I mentioned that I was in the flight instructor world and training the next generation of Navy Marine Corps fighter pilots. One of the biggest things that we taught the graduation event, so to speak, was this idea of landing on the aircraft carrier without aided benefit of just taking the airplane, stick and throttle, and and landing on the aircraft carrier with the tail hook and launching off with the catapult, and that whole evolution, that was huge. That was a kind of a rite of passage for Navy Marine Corps fighter pilots. And with technology, there's a system called Magic Carpet, and it's changing how naval aviation works through the automation and the technology that we have in the airplane. And one of the things that the Navy Marine Corps has recently decided on is that now we're taking fixed wing aviators are now no longer going to be required to, in order to get winged, which is the graduation event, in order to be certified as a naval aviator, you're not required to land on the aircraft carrier prior to that. Now, obviously, once you get into your fleet squadron and you're flying your tactical airplane, you'll go to the boat there and learn those skills. But again, you're learning through an advanced automation. So there's a lot of debate around that of is that just good use of technology and money resources if the student's never going to land on the aircraft carrier without the aid of technology, or is it like old school training to teach them to do it? Or there's that tension of, well, technology fails, and when you're out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that's not the time to be going, oh wow, I really wish my HUD was working, or the systems that I've relied on to aid my skill set are no longer there. That's a bad place to be. So it's a constant struggle. It's a constant challenge. But again, I think it comes back to this idea of building the culture around continuous improvement. And how do we get our people aligned with this idea of, we're going to be better, we're going to be more effective? And that's really, it can meet folks where they are. It can meet organizations if you're at an operational tactical level, a fire chief or something along those lines, that structuring debrief in such a way that folks can learn from the experience that they just had, whether it be operationally real world experience or in training. You can pick apart the good and the bad, and that's very much what I teach, is this idea of we need to evaluate both what went well and what didn't go well, so we can pull those pieces out that we can learn from them to improve on the next time we do it.
I want to talk about what a good debrief and a bad debrief look like, but just before we do, it just popped in my squirrel brain.
Sure.
When you are preparing to learn manually how to take off with the catapult, how to land with the hook, is there a simulation on a runway that you start with? Because I imagine the margin for error off a ship is probably not very acceptable.
Yeah, and it's actually, you probably laugh when I tell folks that it's honestly, it's so kind of previous generations that the technology, people are like, really, that's how you do it, that's it. And really what it is, James, is we literally paint the aircraft carrier deck onto the runway. So we have an 8,000 foot runway with at the very end of the approach end, where we're looking to touch down, is a painted aircraft carrier flight deck that is taking up, a 1/16 of the entire runway. So, and we use the same, what we call the meatball, the vertical glide slope indication. We use that's going to center around touchdown on that flight deck, that simulated painted flight deck, in the exact spot where we want to. And because flying carrier aviation is so demanding, that we start training student naval aviators in that on the ground simulation from the very first flights that they do. So every single pass, no matter what they went out to do, the mission of the sortie, whether it's, complex formation flying or air to ground ordnance delivery or, fighter weapons delivery, whatever it is, when they come back, we spend a 10, 15, 20 minutes of that sortie just focusing around the carrier planning, because even though we're aiding them through technology, we still want them to see what the discipline is required to balance the elements that are required to land an aircraft on an aircraft carrier.
That's amazing. It's funny. I guess it probably worked all those years ago. So they just like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly, right? Like, hey, how can we train? What would be the best type of simulator for training when we're not on an aircraft carrier? Oh, I got an idea. Let's paint the aircraft carrier on the runway. Yeah, that'll work. Let's do that. And it's just so consequently, what you'll see if you go to a naval air station is you'll see an 8,000 foot runway, and then you'll see at the very approach end, usually offset because it's where the lens is to where the touchdown zone is. That proportion is set so it's the same as an aircraft carrier. It's just a tremendous black, with all the tire marks of where the touchdown zone is. So you have this long, pristine runway, and then you've got this one area of where everybody is touching down over the years. It's really something amazing.
My in-laws live in Schertz, Texas, just outside San Antonio, and they talk about the kind of touch and go. Would that be the kind of drill that they're doing then? Are they landing and then taking off straight away?
That's exactly right. And like I said, when we come back from a training sortie, we're probably going to spend, very rarely, unless fuel is a concern where we really, in order to get the learning objectives met during the sortie, we really had to use most of the fuel for that. In the absence of that situation where we're fuel restricted and we have to land the airplane, I always, as an instructor, thought that, every time we come back, we should be doing 2, 3, maybe even 4 touch and goes, just because the carrier landing is so demanding. It's such a skill set, and more to the point, and here's something that I think you can relate to, is the fatigue of having just executed the mission. There's an endurance element that we need to train our bodies, and Navy Marine Corps fighter pilots need to have trained themselves. As an instructor, I felt it incumbent upon me to pass that training along from the perspective of, you need to be able to do perhaps the most taxing mental and physical thing that you're going to do the entire sortie. You may have gone out, and sometimes our, Afghanistan missions, and even to a lesser extent Iraq, but sometimes these are multi-hour missions, right? You need to be able to come back at night in an aircraft carrier with the deck pitching. You need to be able to do the most difficult thing after that whole experience. And my suspicion is that in the fire service, sometimes that's the same, right? The most challenging, physical, demanding thing that you're going to do might be at the very end of the rescue or of the mission. So I think it's incumbent upon us as instructors to ensure that we're building that endurance in there. So yes, very much to your point, at the end of the sortie, that's when we focus around those touch and goes.
I'm trying to remember if I got my facts straight. I had Dave Burke on a long time ago from Echelon Front. I think he was a Marine pilot. Did you ever fly with him, or have I got the wrong branch?
I never flew with him, but I certainly, with Echelon Front and the work he's doing now in leadership development, we kind of operate in similar circles now with the work that I'm doing and helping teams improve performance through debrief. So I did not know him in the Marine Corps, but I have come to know the work that he's doing and what he's doing now with Echelon Front. Yeah.
Well, I want to walk through the rest of your kind of military journey, but before we do, you mentioned about bad debrief, good debrief. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So again, I work now with a lot of folks to help their team develop this idea of the culture of continuous improvement. And one of the ways that we do that is by having a structured debrief model. And there are, in the years of teaching this, and again, I was fortunate to study a lot of the principle centered portion of this was developed during my postgraduate work at Harvard. But it turns out that there are some things that differentiate good debriefs from bad debriefs, and there are some of those things are, if we start with what makes a bad debrief, almost the opposite of it is what makes a good debrief. And what we find is, because we're not trained in how to debrief, we're just kind of left out there to figure this thing out. And you and I have both served with some leaders who are good leaders and some leaders who are bad leaders, and there's no, we try and develop leadership, but sometimes there's just things that people pick up along the way that make them good leaders. And where I try and help is identifying the leadership development of breaking down a debrief and helping them become better leaders individually, but really more importantly, to help their team improve. Because as a leader, that's the ultimate, credential that we have. Is our team a high performing team? Well, then that's really the end state of what leadership is. So at any rate, the things that make a bad debrief, let's start there, are sometimes the more common things that unfortunately I see when I'm working with teams. And those are that the debrief is way too long. Folks come into a debrief and they're just they're really taking notes that are really picking apart exactly what happened as we move through. And it's fatiguing to our team when the debrief is that long. So the debrief has to be short. It's got to be concise. It's got to be, and the model that I teach is a 5-minute debrief model. The second point is it's got to be structured. We can't come into a debrief without knowing. The team should know exactly what we're going to talk about in the order that we're going to talk about it. And the model that I focus around is a 5-step model, and it's the same 5 steps every single time that the team comes in to debrief. So that mentally prepares folks when they're executing to know this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what our goals were for the mission. We're going to talk about what worked and what didn't work, and the system that we give folks teaches that same 5-step model. So it's consistent every time. So it's short, it's concise, it's focused. And then the last thing that good debriefs do is they focus around continuous improvement. And this is probably the biggest one. Most commonly, an untrained debrief is focused around what bad things just happened. We can't let that happen again. So we better debrief and figure this thing out. And that is not the model that Navy and Marine Corps works on. We debrief because that's how we drive toward improvement. Because one of the principles that we found is experience alone doesn't make us better. Reflection followed by adjustment does. And that's a core tenet that flows through all of this idea of debriefing, is that if we can keep doing the exact same thing, but unless we're pausing to stop and taking the lessons learned from that and adjusting, that's how we're going to get better the next time we do it. So, and then of course, what makes a good debrief is just the opposite. So it's structured, it's timely, it's structured, and it focuses around the positive nature of continuous improvement.
I think it's a pretty universally accepted observation that the best leaders out there are also some of the most humble.
Yeah.
And you get these veteran, firefighters I've
Mm,
had on the show, 30-year Rescue
yeah.
One, FDNY. And they're asking me questions, what did you do? And it's like, well,
Sure.
you're the expert, but there's just that constant
Yeah.
student mentality. Conversely, as you alluded to, some of the poor leaders or poor bosses that I've worked
Yeah.
under, it's
Hmm.
the opposite. There's no there's a fragile ego, there's no humility, and that's a complete barrier to innovation, progress, and learning from some of these near misses that we've had.
Yep.
Through your lens, what creates this lack of humility, and how does a team, an organization, a station help turn that around to get someone you know, to understand the mission and not have this kind of knee-jerk reaction anytime someone suggests that maybe we should reflect
Oh,
and grow from it.
what a great question. That gets really to the heart of a lot of the work that I'm privileged to do now. And I think the experience alone of debriefing and focusing around debriefing creates a culture by its very nature of doing the action of debriefing that is really the tangible benefit. And I'll tell you what I mean here. So you cannot institute a culture, you cannot institute a system of debriefing that wherever we go, whenever we do, we go out to a call, we go out to a training. When we come back to the station, we're going to sit around for 5 minutes with the team that just went out, and we are going to go through a systemized model that is going to not be punitive, but is going to pull the lessons learned out. You cannot do that repetitively and not see a culture develop where it's okay to make mistakes, that it's okay to learn. Because what that does is it instills that, okay, we are all together on a path toward being better in what we do. That's the culture that we're trying to install. And by using a debrief, it's such an important tool in a leader's toolkit to say, hey, look, we're going to go out there. We're not searching for perfection. Perfection is something that exists in Mythland. And this is where the fighter aviation background, we never chased perfection. We did chase excellence. The expectation was not that we are going to be perfect out there, but the expectation very much is that we're going to be better the next time that we do it than the time that we just did it or the time we did it before. And if we're not improving, that is a negative. That's where we're really going to focus around this idea of not getting better the next time we do it. So, and the debrief is the mechanism that we use. So I would suggest to you that as we look at leadership development, and those leaders that are kind of the do as I say, not as I do, those don't, that mentality is not compatible with someone who's going to focus around a debrief culture, because you simply can't do it. And I'm happy to get into what a good debrief, how the leader leads the debrief, and that humility that has got to be, because there's no faking it, right? We've seen leaders, you can't go out there and make mistakes yourself as a leader and then come in the debrief and go, yeah, we're not going to talk about my mistakes. I want to focus on these mistakes. You might as well just like hang it up right now and walk out, because a team's not going to follow you anywhere if you do that. Conversely, if you come into a debrief as a leader and the first thing you say is, okay, these are the mistakes that I made, this is how I'm going to get better next time. Well, wow. Just the act of doing that, there's not a person out there that goes, oh, well, if the leader is admitting that they're not perfect and that they make mistakes and that they're on the same path that I'm on of continuous improvement and striving to be better the next time, well, then I guess it's okay for me to make mistakes. And in high level, high stress professions where performance matters, like the fire industry, like the first responder industry, in those professions, that idea of continuous growth, there's just no getting around it. That's what drives continuous improvement, is this idea of we're going to learn from what just happened so that we can apply it to be better tomorrow. And that's the debrief is a tool that leaders can use to do that.
It's funny because that parallels the mental health conversation too. And I've seen this so often. You know, you have someone who has courageous vulnerability in a leadership position, and they're around a kitchen table and know it was a rough call, and they begin with their perception of that call, and maybe even say, you know, let me tell you about this other call that I had, and I went to a dark place for a bit, and, you know, this is what I used to kind of climb myself out. That absolutely amplifies the opportunity for other people to say, oh, I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, I've been struggling with this one. But if you walk in beating your chest and, you know, change the subject, then anyone that was hoping for an opportunity to say that they needed some help at that moment, you just shut them down. So whether it's the leadership and the training evolution, or whether it's the mental health conversation, it's the same thing. You know, humility not only is incredible on the training ground, but it also is the key, you know, asset to open a conversation when it comes to someone who's struggling.
Absolutely. And and those lessons of humility arrive for us as leaders at different stages and in different ways of our life. And that's, you know, again, sometimes there are formal leadership development areas, and sometimes it's just life lessons that teach us. And I remember, for me, one of the stories that I share in the keynote, and it's in the book, is this idea of, you know, I remember being on the flight deck before my very first combat mission, and we were operating in the Northern Arabian Gulf off the coast of Kuwait. And our mission on that day was to provide close air support for Marine Corps infantry units advancing north to Baghdad. And this is a mission that I had trained, you know, years for. Simulation, real world, you know, training. And I remember sitting as the plane captain was strapping me into the ejection seat, just before he stepped down off the airplane, he tapped me on the shoulder and said words I'll never forget. He said, "Good luck, sir. This time it's for real." And I remember, as I closed the canopy, thinking in that moment, I've trained my entire life for this very mission. And then I thought, what if I go out there and make a mistake? What if I drop a bomb on the wrong target? What if I harm innocent women and children? What if I get shot down, captured, and never see my wife and family again? And all these questions are running through my mind, and they lead me to the greatest question of all, which is, what if I'm not good enough? And what I came to learn is that question shaped who I would become, because that type of humility that is a result of asking that question, that, man, I tell you, James, that question, I don't care who you are. I don't care what your background is. If you're a human, particularly if you're a human that's doing high risk, great things, you're asking yourself that question. There's not a human out there that doesn't come to that question at some point in their life. And what I came to learn in my life is that the answer to that question was never going to be solved in that mission. The answer to am I good enough is not going to be, it's not a single event that's going to answer that. What's going to answer that question over time is, have I prepared myself in such a way that I'm ready for the moment? And that is where my work with debriefing helps folks develop and get on that path toward continuous improvement, so that when they are faced with high stress situations, they know the answer to the question is, yeah, I'm ready, because I've been through this many, many times, and I've got a situation where I understand that my past experience alone doesn't make me better. The fact that I've been reflecting and adjusting, that's what makes me ready for this moment.
I remember one of my Delta guests said he's never seen more imposter syndrome than in a Delta team room.
I love it.
Now think about
I
that.
love it. Yeah, I love it. And that's so that, you know, that's great. That is so well said. And it's, there's a place for bravado, right? There's a place for confidence for sure, because in the high risk work that you and your background and the folks that you support do, you know, we don't want somebody who's insecure and not confident in what they're doing. There's no place for that in there. Now, having said that, there's also no place for the arrogant, nothing can hurt me, I'm invulnerable. Like, nobody wants to be around that person either. And the irony of that comment that you just made about the Delta team with the imposter syndrome is that you would think, because of their image and that they, hey man, everybody on this team's got squared away, right? Everybody knows that they belong. This is the best of the best. This is no, everybody's asking that question.
Exactly. It's just what you do.
Am I good enough? Yeah, for sure.
Well, I want to go back to the kind of aviation journey. What did the landscape look like as far as training deployments pre 9/11? And then let's talk about that day through your eyes.
Yeah, that's so fun to go back and look over the course of a career and see how that one day changed not only the landscape of the military service, but as a military service member, you know, my life was dramatically changed of what would happen in the months and years after 9/11. So pre 9/11, we were focused largely on the biggest conflict that we had experienced was probably the Balkan conflict, right? Scott O'Grady getting shot down and Basher 5-2 and that whole story. And so our focus was around kind of what I would call a non full scale conflict, more of a surgical strike. We're going to provide no fly zones over Iraq. We're going to focus around that. So a lot of the focus that we trained to, both in the cockpit and our survival and evasion training, was focused around this idea of a isolated conflict. After 9/11, that changed dramatically. Obviously, the operations tempo, you know, prior to 9/11, our operations, you know, our normal deployment was 6 months. You know, we would go out on the aircraft carrier and as a member of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Unit, and it was a 6-month, or in association with the Marine Corps Expeditionary Unit, it was a 6-month deployment. After 9/11, like my first deployment in Iraq after 9/11 was 12 months, and that was may not seem like a big difference, but when you're at sea for that long and in that operational tempo, there are some human factors, things that develop that we didn't experience prior. So that was a big piece, and that was a big element for us to learn of how do we sustain high level operational tempos over much longer periods of time because the necessity of manpower and the requirements for the end state service that we were providing as fixed wing aviators, those skill sets still needed to be provided, even if we didn't have the training command wasn't producing the pilots at the pace that we needed. So that was a big element. And then as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the operational tempo continued on, we got much better at managing those threats and challenges of a higher operational tempo. And we were able to kind of reduce the stress associated with those. But it's tremendously stressful when the machine is operating at that tempo, not only for the individual, but also for the folks that are behind, the wife, the kids, those type of things, because we're leaving gaps where they're left to develop not only for 6 months now, but for 12 months. It's a big difference when you come back and what you left.
What about 9/11, the day itself? Where were you? And talk to me about, that event through your eyes.
Yeah. So that day we were coming back from what we call combined arms exercise, CAC. So at the time I was stationed in North Carolina, and we were those combined arm exercises for the Marine Corps are done at a place called 29 Palms in California. And so we were actually had completed that training cycle, which was a multi-week training cycle. And we were coming back on the day 9/11 occurred. Some of our advanced party had already come back, and then some of them were in transit to come back, hadn't quite gotten airborne yet when the airspace closure occurred. So our squadron was kind of little bits and pieces. I had just gotten back to North Carolina as part of the advanced crew coming back, and I remember turning on the TV and got a call from another pilot in the squadron and was like, "Turn on the TV. Do you see what's going on here?" And the first airplane hits, and then the second airplane hits, and it's really like so many folks that recount that story. It's when the second airplane hits that we knew that we were living in a different world. And having already been a combat qualified aviator, I remember we had an all officer meeting the day after everybody got back, which it took them, they got special waivers because they were military to fly and finish the transit back. But it wasn't very long at all that it was very clear that we were going to war. And as individuals who were trained for war, it was very much get ready, because it's the machine is now in full operation.
Now, obviously, you transitioned into the commercial space. How hard is it technically to fly those planes into those buildings?
Well, it's certainly easier than landing the airplane. That's for sure. I would say, and now we've done research and understand the level of training that the terrorist had in preparation for that. And once, like in so many ways, once you see kind of what happened, it's fairly easy to see the signals that you should have caught beforehand. And certainly one of those big points is when somebody goes to flight training and is not interested in learning about how to land the airplane. That's probably a red signal that something unusual is going on. And again, these are lessons learned that have now developed safeguards to ensure that we don't have a similar situation occur. But technically, I would say not that hard, really. Of course, the bigger challenge is the mental piece, right? Of knowing that you're on a suicide mission and knowing that nobody's coming back from this. And when you take off, this is your last day alive. But for those that have already been ingrained in that radicalized mentality, as we know those individuals were, the physical flying of a commercial airliner into the side of a building, certainly for the New York case, is not that hard. For the Pentagon, much more challenging, because the Pentagon is only so high. That took some skill set in a deranged way. That took us some skill set to get the airplane flying that low, that fast, to not overshoot the Pentagon building itself.
And then, this is not, conspiracy theory conversation or anything, but
Sure.
I would imagine, from a complete layman's point of view, if you have these aircraft hitting these, extremely populated, vulnerable targets,
Yep.
that there would be the potential of scrambling military aircraft and maybe them having to make that god awful decision of shooting it down.
Sure.
With Flight 93, do you think it was courageous passengers that wrestled them their way into the cockpit, or is there possibility of another story?
I think that we got to go with what's most likely, and I think what's most likely in that case is that it was the passengers that saw what was going on, and the circumstances surrounding that. If I don't know if you've ever had a chance to visit that site up in Pennsylvania, but it's a tremendous memorial and tribute to Todd Beamer and those other folks that really rallied. And I would suggest to you that, in my experience, airline passengers and our culture changed on that day, and it really started on that flight, on Flight 93, because that is, you want to talk about folks that gave their lives in the war on terror and fighting terrorists. I think you're negligent if you don't start with the passengers that were on that airplane, because the work that I did in Iraq and Afghanistan, I believe, began that day with their courageous actions of saying, you know what, we're not going to live through this unless we take dramatic action here. We've got the evidence we see on the radio. We're talking to our friends and families. There's already been three airliners that have gone down. We're being told to keep our seats, but that's just a ploy. We're going to take action. And I think Americans, their identity changed in some way, was shaped by those ideas. Because if you look at now, even, as a commercial airline pilot now, if there's a disruption in the back, the fellow passengers are part of the solution. Mm-hmm. They're not going to sit by. And we saw this with, the shoe bomber and other folks that have happened since 9/11. Like, everybody's on alert now, because the passengers themselves are part of the solution toward a disruptive passenger or potential terrorist on board the airliner. And it started on that day.
Well, and this is why I love this podcast, because I get to ask the people that actually have, a powerful perspective. And you were a fighter pilot, you're a commercial pilot, that this is the kind of conversation that the rest of us, plural, need to hear, because otherwise we listen to CNN or Fox and you don't get the truth from either of those. So
very true. It's probably somewhere in the middle, right? That's what I tell my kids. The truth's probably not on any one of those channels individually, but perhaps somewhere in the middle.
Absolutely. Well, that's the perfect segue. And this would be interesting because obviously you've got a much broader distance between you and the enemy in a lot of these situations that you were in. Sure. But the average American is fed a very polarizing perspective of the war, but especially by those two channels. Either, kill them all, let God sort them out, stacking bodies on one side, or they're all baby killers on the other. And in the middle are our, men and women, arguably boys and girls, that are, serving overseas with the flag on their shoulder.
Sure.
Two-part question. The first part, regardless of the politics that sent you to these countries, was there a moment where you saw some of the, the horrific things that were being done, that kind of justified, removing some of these individuals from that particular country?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Even in the times that I was not in the airplane, right? Like when we were based, I'm thinking about Afghanistan here. One time, my first tour, we were based in the southern part of Afghanistan at a Kandahar Air Base. And then in my second tour, we were based in the northern part of Afghanistan around, north of Kabul. And those different experiences, even living outside the airplane, you would see things like the Taliban and those that were opposed to sympathizers of the Western uh, populations and helping them grow. You would see them do things like poison the water well, right? Because that was a powerful technique that they would have to use against their own people to say, look, don't help the Americans or the Westerners that were non-indigenous people to Afghanistan. And they would do that, you know, targeted, focused with the intention of sending a message. So there was no shortfall of examples of evil people doing evil things. Let's just say that.
So the other side of that question, one thing again that's not reported, and I've heard so many stories on this show, are acts of kindness and compassion on the battlefield, whether it's from our own men and women, whether it's from the indigenous people that you're serving alongside or trying to protect. What are some memories as far as that when you reflect back?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different experiences of good people trying to do good things and being struggling to do those. Two of them that really come to mind for me. One is this idea of education and developing, particularly little girls in education, because in the Afghan culture, thinking back there, that was a high risk environment to develop young children, particularly women, young girls, to educate them formally. So it was almost done at a non-public. We're going to do it behind closed doors because we don't want the terrorists to come into our community. But it's very tribal, right? All these type of things are happening at a very tightly confined level. And so I would say when you see courageous people doing courageous things, the education of young girls, that was probably one that was noteworthy, that they knew the risks, but they thought that the benefit outweighed the risk and they were going to do it anyway. And so that when I saw that in tribal cultures, that was always noteworthy to me, that they're going to fight the fight because they believe that the value of educating their young girls is worthy of the risk. The other one is, I would say, when I saw good people doing good things is really when I got to Afghanistan, my second tour. That was shortly. Well, actually, I think it was the first tour. It was right around the time that I don't know, Lone Survivor, if you're familiar with that story.
Yeah, Marcus Luttrell.
Yeah, exactly. Marcus Luttrell and that whole event happened, and that happened in northern Afghanistan, and where what we saw there is, again, very tribal, right? He essentially was taken in and developed a relationship of, hey, we are going as a tribal. The tribal elder was like, we're going to take care of this individual, not because we believe what he's fighting for or we think he's a good person, just because it's the right human thing to do, to take care of a wounded warrior. And I always looked upon that as a sign of the possibility of humanity, of what could be.
I always felt, because I read the book as well, and I felt like the film did a disservice just to the magnitude of risk that that tribe took.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So one more thing, and then we'll progress into the commercial side. When you reflect back now, I know a lot of our veterans are really, morally injured about the way that the withdrawal happened in Afghanistan, especially when a lot of them had the allies that were there that were put in danger or worse. And then there's also a lot of reflection about what people were told as far as the reasons that they were sent to Iraq that ended up being, erroneous. Without loading that question, though, with those two conflicts having served in both, What are your reflections on those, and what needs to be said so we don't repeat those mistakes, if there were any mistakes?
That's a great question. So I think first and foremost, it's important to separate and divorce those two conflicts, because the lessons learned, in my view, are different in each of those. And the first one in Iraq, that example, I think the lesson learned there is one of how we get into these conflicts. And it's interesting to not be dismissive of the idea of there's some parallels between the lessons that we learned, or more to the point didn't learn, from how we've gotten into other conflicts. Perhaps you could draw a parallel toward the evolution of, we're going to start small and then we're going to get bigger, and now we're in a conflict that seemingly has no end with Vietnam, and how that developed. With, we're going to get into Iraq, and is the intelligence, are we making the intelligence read what we want it to read, or are we making decisions based on what the intelligence is telling us? And that is a tremendously valuable lesson to learn for us as a society, and for the folks that take us to war in the Department of Defense and the executive, because it's a very dangerous place to start looking at intelligence and shaping it the way we want it to be, not the way it is. And I'll just leave it there for the lesson learned of Iraq. And then for Afghanistan, you specifically mentioned the withdrawal and what that meant, and how that played out. And that one I see very much differently, because the lesson learned, I think, is a little different, because the country and the dynamics surrounding it were different. I think there, the lesson learned is that democracy is not for everybody. And we run it's a very dangerous, slippery slope for us as a successful Western democracy, even with all of its challenges and scars. We're celebrating our 250th anniversary this year, and that is an experiment that has been going on and has been successful in this idea of people governing themselves. The idea that the lesson learned there from Afghanistan is that model does not work everywhere, and we shouldn't, in my opinion, we should not kid ourselves that it will work and that it's better for every culture. So to that point, I would suggest that once we came to that realization that, there are forces here in Afghanistan that democracy is not necessarily going to take hold, then the challenge then becomes, as Americans, well, what's in our best national security moving forward? And that, I think you mentioned there about, we've seen those dramatic images of the C-17 leaving Kabul, and the folks trying to get on because they're like, hey, this is the pathway. Like, I'm not happy with what's going to be left when you people leave. I thought the only thing that, in retrospect, and we'll see how this plays out in future generations, but I think perhaps more consideration should have been given to keeping a foothold specifically in northern Afghanistan. And, the air base, Bagram Air Base at that point, was heavily built up, because the lesson we learned in the build up to 9/11 is we knew exactly, we knew bin Laden was operating at a place outside Kandahar called Tarnak Farms. That was an Al-Qaeda training group. We know that now every single one of the terrorists on 9/11s had been trained at Tarnak Farms. And that the problem was we didn't have any boots. We had no way to reach them. We could do standoff weapon systems, but the intelligence and the things that we need to operate to be able to pinpoint with precision where certain people are. We didn't have the capabilities to do that. And I keeping it at an on-class level, I think that by having a presence at Bagram Air Base would leave the United States and our allies a very powerful ability to respond to folks that threatened our national security, that may be using the lack of a central government in Afghanistan to collaborate and plot against us.
See, it's so interesting because, again, I've had people from, different countries, different branches, all giving their reflection on this. And
yes,
common denominators are there was no real understanding, or certainly no knowledge disseminated on the tribalism, and that it wasn't a united nation. It was a nation full of lots of little sub-nations, which, as you said, now you come in with democracy, or you expect people to be fighting for this flag, and they're like, well, I don't know what that flag is,
right.
And then also a lot of people said, you have these tier 1 teams, or these special operations, special forces groups that, would go in, would target, the key players, shut down the training camps, but then leave. And this is them saying, this not me. And that way you're avoiding that sense of occupation that I imagine probably created far more enemies than we had if we'd been surgical. So if the men and women boots on the ground have been saying this, where is that conversation? And obviously now we're looking at another conflict where it just seems to be, from my opinion, again, who am I? I'm just a firefighter, but it seems to be another, place where we've sent our children. They're coming back in coffins already, and there's no real plan or exit strategy, and based seemingly on false information in the first place.
Well said. And in a roundabout way, this really underscores this idea of experience alone doesn't make us better, right? And what we need to be better in a national security environment is reflection followed by adjustment. We need to look at each of these campaigns and pull out, hey, look, these were the things that we did well in these, and these were the things that we didn't. And we have, in the American military history, we've got excellent examples of both, right? We can look at our success in World War II. We can look at our success in the Iraq War, the George H.W. Bush led Iraq War, where we had a clear mission, we achieved the mission, and we were done, right? Liberate Kuwait. Everybody knew that was what we were going to do. And as soon as Kuwait was liberated, we're done here. We're moved, and I think that there's some real strong points to pull out of there. And then, of course, we see, like we were just talking about with Iraq, Afghanistan, and the situation that we see evolving on a daily basis with our military involvement with Iran. These type of challenges, it's incumbent upon us to learn from the experiences that we've just had in other military environments and pick out what led to success in those campaigns and areas where we can be better. Because one thing we know is that if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to keep getting what we're getting. So those type of environments of when we commit our men and women, and is it a valuable, worthwhile risk to expose our military members to send them in harm's way? The calculus that drives that needs to be very precise and very measured.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I want to transition to your transition. I guess you used that word twice in the same sentence. What made you pull the trigger on transitioning out of the military? Excuse me. And then, as we alluded to earlier, it can be very jarring. You're going from pilot to pilot. Did that reduce the impact, or was there still that kind of shock initially from leaving this organization you've been a part of for so long?
Yeah, another great question. So for me, everybody's got their own story. Mine was, we had reached, my wife and I, and we had a young family at the time, two small children. We had reached a point where we were trying to measure and plan our family around the ideas of what we wanted it to be in the future. And we were at that crossroads that most members in the military come to, which is that I was at the end of my initial commitment, which was 10 years after I got winged as a naval aviator. So we were at that point of do we leave the military now and pursue a career in commercial aviation and start that life, or do we continue on? And both of those, that took us a long time. That was a decision that my wife and I thought over for months to come to a decision. And for a long time, we were running both of those in parallel. I was talking to the monitor about the detailer about the person that assigns the next job that you're going to do in the military, and then also pursuing interviewing at airlines and that type of thing. And eventually we just decided that there were really two factors. One, it was what was best for our family. And that was a decision that my wife and I made together, because both of us were very happy in the Marine Corps and the path that we were going. There was that. And then the other, so it was about what was best for our family. And then the other element was, for me personally, I had done what I had come into the military to do. I had had the honor of flying off of ships, jets. I had seen combat. I had done the machine, I just, my timing was so uniquely, there were folks that had served 30 years careers just prior to me that never saw any type of, like, it was always a training environment. And I just happened to, my timing was right, that I was able to do things in the military. Not that, so, most of them were not ones that I wanted to do necessarily, but there is an element of, we train for certain things and we want to see if the training has paid off. And there was a certain element of that for my world, and I had done most of that, so it was just the right time. And then to the second part of your question about the transition into civilian airliners and what that transition was like, I will say that was a real challenge, because I had just come from this high pressure, high stress, high tempo operational world of combat aviation and very complex missions, and really getting into this idea of high work tempo. And the airline can be like that, but it's a much more diligent teamwork, crew. I mean, that was probably the biggest thing for me personally, James, was that, I went from flying airplanes where I was single seat, I was making all the decisions, there was no crew coordination, was between another individual, guy or gal, in a completely separate jet. I was working all the switches, the radars, the whole deal. Like, it was all me, to a crew coordinated airplane, which that's a key part of what makes aviation safety in the commercial world so high level safety wise, is that it is a team effort. And it's not that I'm not going to make mistakes. It's that when I make a mistake, we've instituted the correct things through checklists and through monitoring of what the other pilot is doing, that we're going to catch those mistakes and we're going to trap them. And that is a whole different flying experience. And it took me a while, honestly, to develop that enhanced skill set of using crew coordination as an enhancer for aviation safety in the way that I actually flew the airplane. And of course, now as a captain, that's really what it's about. I mean, flying the airplane, stick and rudder and that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. That there's a place for that, but really it's about the decision making. When do we go? When do we not go? How do we avoid the weather? How are we keeping the flight attendants safe? All these other, do we have enough fuel? All these other kind of higher level aviation safety leadership decision matrix. That's largely what I'm doing now.
Your industry is interesting to pull this particular conversation from. There has been so much opposition until very recently to give our first responders, especially our firefighters and EMTs and paramedics, the rest and recovery that they need to literally make life and death decisions at 3 a.m, maybe out after pulling them out of a fire.
Right.
Talk to me about the kind of metamorphosis of the sleep conversation and what standards you guys are held to these days.
Right. So what we have found through this idea of mishap investigation and studying is that there's a strong, we study now, everybody says after a mishap happens, one of the words that most people are familiar with is pilot error, right? Pilot error. And that the reason for that is because in most mishaps, even ones that result mechanically, there is an element of human performance in the mishap. And usually, as the operator of the machine, the pilot is usually somewhere in that causal factor chain, somewhere at some point. That's just the burden of being an aviator. That's what we live with. And to your point, one of the things that we have learned over mishap investigations over the years is that pilot fatigue heavily influences pilot performance. And so one of the things that we now mandate is pilot has to have certain rest requirements. They have to be in the world in which I live now. The FAA mandates that they need to be able to receive 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. If we don't provide that to them, then they are not legal to fly. And it even gets to the point, James, that there was a mishap probably 10 plus years ago now up in Buffalo, New York, where pilot fatigue was a major causal factor. And as a result of that, now every single flight that I fly, not just to start the day, but every single leg that I fly, I have to sign, and my co-pilot signs it as well, my first officer, sign a document that says that I am well rested and physically ready to perform this flight. And it's a lot of times like just a part of the checklist that did we sign it? But the idea behind it is very valuable, in that the idea of, like, at the end of the day, I'm the one that knows whether I'm rested or not. It's not somebody in scheduling. It's not my leadership. It's me as an individual. And when we have built that collective culture of safety, we have to rely on the individuals that are out there executing to be able to say, I'm ready or I'm not ready. And one of the lessons that we learned in aviation is that when we push that responsibility down to the actual individual that's going out there and executing, in your world, the actual firefighter that's leaving the station, are he or her ready to actually go execute that level of responsibility? Really, when we get to that point where they're responsible for their rest, we see some really beneficial events happen because they are empowered to say, look, if I go out there, I'm going to threaten my own life, or I'm going to threaten the lives of others. It's a real leadership. Everybody's got to have buy-in on it, right? It can't be just, that's definitely a top down type of thing, that not a bottom up. And in aviation, we have come to embrace that idea that a well-rested pilot is a better performing pilot.
What about the culture of Southwest? When I look at the airline industry, I started flying when I was really young, but my first transatlantic was on Virgin Atlantic in '94. So
Okay.
pretty
Yeah.
long experience as a passenger.
Sure.
And so I've seen what I would argue were some of the great times, and then you've seen the picking apart of the industry and the kind of decline of pay and some of these other
Yes.
areas that have just affected it. But
Right.
Southwest's, when I see videos of kindness and compassion, for example, a lot of times they're on your airliners. So what is it about that company and their culture that has set them apart from, maybe the downward spiral, for lack of a better word, of some of these other airlines that have cut and cut and cut, where the customer experience isn't actually very pleasant anymore?
Right. And the first thing I'll say on that is it is very much, you mentioned the word culture. It's very much a cultural thing. And that's one part of it, is that we drive that idea of the customer experience. And, first, of course, first and foremost is safety. We're going to provide safe transport, because at the end of the day, what we do is we connect people to things that are important to them. Every person that gets on that airplane, whether they're going to a business meeting, whether they're going to see grandma and grandpa, whether they're going on vacation, they're getting on that airplane to connect with something that's important to them. And so our job is to, one, get them there safely and make that connection, but also provide them an experience where they are uplifted. It's not lost on any of us at Southwest that our culture is, and our stock price is LUV, love, right? We are considered the love airline. And that is an intentional, that is an intentional part of our culture that we instill. Having said that, as we continue to grow and we experience the same challenges that you spoke of with all the other airlines, Virgin is the one that you mentioned, but it's not. We can look at the history of airline travel, and we see the graveyard is full of Pan Ams and TWAs and other airlines, and even just within the last month or so, we see Spirit Airlines. So it's a very, very challenging industry to continue to develop. And as Southwest grows, it's increasingly harder to keep that culture of providing good experience for the traveler. And as an airline, as a captain, I consider one of my jobs is to ensure that we're adequately balancing both of those. Safety is a non-negotiable. Everything follows that safety, but we want to be able to provide safe transportation to the American public by also providing them that love atmosphere of, you're welcome here. We're glad you're here. We're going to get you to where you're going in a way that is hopefully going to make your day better, not worse.
Yeah, I mentioned Virgin. I think they are one of the ones that have retained it. I really do.
Yes.
I actually saw, it's not funny for the people in Spirit Airlines, but there was a meme that went out, and it was a Spirit plane, and then there's a transition into Spirit Halloween. They always fill the vacant shops.
Yeah,
So that
right.
was witty yet tragic. But
isn't that great? Yeah.
But I mean, I'm sure even at the moment, with the gas prices being how they are, that's becoming a barrier to entry to people doing exactly what you're talking about, seeing their loved ones and getting to where they need to go. Because I've watched the prices go up. I'm going to be going back to Europe probably soon. And I mean, that's another huge challenge that your industry faces. I had an interesting experience on a Virgin flight. I think it was about 3 years ago now. Was on the tarmac at Heathrow Airport. They close the
Mm-hmm.
doors. Very last passenger walks up, and it's a big, 747 or whatever it was.
Right.
And so I'm facing forward, noise canceling headphones on. And then I start seeing people turning around, and, I recognize that face of distress. And I look behind, and that last gentleman had basically just keeled over in the aisle. And unlike some of these stories that I see on the internet, where there were 27 cardiologists coming back from a conference, or no one that had emergency medicine experience, some amazing, compassionate bystanders that had some CPR.
Sure.
But I ended up, working a code with these people, and then eventually the fire brigade came on.
Wow.
And London Fire Brigade isn't like highly trained on a medical point of view; they're first responder trained. So then we dragged this poor gentleman to the galley, and then keep working, and then the London paramedics show up, and then eventually, I say to them, all right, are you guys good now? Because it was time to rotate on the chest. And unlike when I was in uniform, where I, go back to my partner and we clean up the rig and we're talking to the hospital, I just washed the blood off my hands and went and took a seat again. It was very, very strange, very jarring.
Yeah.
But then I realized the impact on all the air crew, and a lot of them were shaken. Some went home that day. A lot of them I have so much admiration for. We took off and they served these people for 9 hours. It was incredible.
Yeah.
But one of them said to me she'd been working for, I think it was like 26 years and had never had a cardiac arrest on the plane. And I'm the damn black cloud grim reaper when it comes to this stuff. So if it's going to happen, I'm going to be there. But my point, the reason for telling this is, I know these are rare occurrences. I think Virgin had only had, I think she said 6 or 9 of the entire fleet the entire year. So with you now being in this commercial space, what have been some of the emergencies that you've had to deal with from a captain's position?
Yeah, so it's interesting that the medical, we have a lot of medicals on board, medical emergencies, but they usually don't come anywhere near that level of severity, right? They're typically someone's on, not feeling well. I just had one a week ago. I was flying from Boston to Los Angeles, and we had a situation where the individual was, the flight attendants, it's progressive, hey, we got somebody in the back not feeling well. Now they're lightheaded. Now they passed out, kind of thing. And, now we're administering oxygen, and that certainly is we see a lot of those. I wouldn't say a lot, but those are far more common than the full cardiac arrest situation that you're describing. So those type of emergencies happen. And the nice thing about that is that we in the airline industry have outreach where the captain now can are in, at least at Southwest, our dispatcher and our ground support personnel are in Dallas, Texas. So we can talk to them via satellite and get them on communication. And then the team now is going to, between the captain, the dispatcher, and we reach out to a medical emergency room. It's a hospital emergency room. And the doctor gets on, and the flight attendant is providing vital signs and those type of things. So we're able to mitigate the risk of medical emergencies through the support staff that we can now, through satellite communication, get on board to a collaborative situation. So I would say medical emergencies are one. And then, of course, every now and again, we're having the mechanical type of emergencies. And most of the time, those are not catastrophic. And, we see those by the really low mishap rate in aviation broadly. But so we're able to work through those through the use of checklists and as a team, and we can divert the airplane and those type of things. But I tell you, James, the net result of all of these type of emergencies is that they can cause disruption to air travel. And as a passenger, that's what's so frustrating, right? You're sitting in your airport like, why is this airplane 3 hours late? Like, is this the best that we can do? And the answer to that question is some things that are inside of our control as operators, as an airline captain. There are some things that I can control, and there are some things that I just can't control. So my job is to make sure that I'm making decisions that are putting the public safety first and foremost, while trying to efficiently get them to where they're going. And that, regardless of the emergency that we're dealing with, that's the task at hand.
I hit one more area and then we'll go to some closing questions. I know we just hit 2 hours, but what was interesting, I've actually responded as a medic a few times on different flights, and there was one that ended up being syncope. So just someone really, just stood up too fast, I think, or I don't know if they were in the restroom, but it was a blood pressure issue. But at that point, and I can't remember, it was one of the domestic flights, they brought out everything. It was like all the gear I would have in the back of my rescue and as a paramedic.
Right.
This cardiac arrest with Virgin, every single piece of equipment they had to request for permission to bring out and open. And we're talking about a cardiac arrest. We needed a defibrillator, we needed airways, we needed drugs. And it took forever. I was about to put my lips on this dude right when someone had brought out the right mask, because it had been forever and he was turning blue. And then more recently, I was, again, someone that was really more than likely having anxiety, but he said he had a history of asthma. So again, they were trying to get permission for an albuterol inhaler. I did checked his vitals and listened to his lungs, and he was saying that worked in the past. But again, it took forever. So I don't know if you have a perspective of this, but for the Good Samaritan on the plane, there seem to be a lot of barriers to actually getting the equipment to even, mitigate some of these areas, especially if, as you said, you're trying to nip it in the bud so it doesn't become something bigger. Right.
So I can't speak to other airlines and how they do it. I'll just say that as a captain in my airline, our philosophy is one that if we are in an emergency situation, defined as we are going through, we're either in an emergency situation or we're not. And once the decision is made that we're in an emergency situation, we're not going to piecemeal the response to this thing. We're going to make strong strategic decisions about what level to escalate the emergency to, but we are always going to provide more support, not less support. So what I tell my flight attendants when we're in that situation, and we do have some resources like, the emergency medical kit, which handles, covers a lot of different things, and the portable oxygen bottle and all these other things. Yes, there are certain things that all those are maintenance controlled items. So before the airplane can push back, we need multiple portable oxygen bottles that are fully charged, that are on the airplane. Those type of things require, and that's why these other airlines that you're talking about, because once you tap into those, once you break the seal on those, now that's required, that's additional paperwork, that's write-ups, there's those type of things, there's maintenance involved to restore and replenish those. And so that's where there's this idea of, wow, if we go to that level, now I got to do this additional work for the response. So as in many emergency response cases, what we're trying to do is marry the appropriate level of response with the resources that are required, and equal those out. And my philosophy, just as a captain, is always use whatever you need and we'll figure it out once we get on the ground.
Yeah, which was definitely the first experience I had, and that would have been a good one to have the second time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, then going to the closing questions. So the first one I love to ask, we'll get to your book in a moment, but is there a book written by someone else that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
Yeah, I've recommended this book more times. This was mandatory. This was probably one of the very few mandatory reading books for my children. That I was like, this is because I found it to be life shaping even to this day, and that is the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Just the idea of principle centered leadership. There's so many concepts in that book that are foundational, I believe, toward living a principle centered, prosperous life. The idea that, first of all, we don't get to choose. We are not in control of the principles that guide our life. We break ourselves against those principles. So the idea is to align with principles and then lead our life in congruence with what those principles are sharing with us. That is probably one of the biggest lessons from that book. And then, of course, the other one is the idea is that it's an inside out game. We focus on developing ourselves, and then we go into society and we share our gifts and our God-given talents with others. And in the world in which we live of social media, it's really easy to get that inverted, where our outside imagery is actually more important than what Stephen Covey calls primary greatness, which is our alignment with a principle-centered life. And so, long-winded answer to your very succinct question, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey.
Brilliant. What about documentaries, films, or television that you love?
Well, I would certainly be consistent with our earlier conversation. I would certainly be remiss if I didn't put Top Gun, the original Top Gun, not the second one. One of the interesting things, and I use this in a lot of my speaking keynotes. There's a clip in Top Gun that I specifically reference that is, having seen Top Gun from the side of actually living in as a naval aviator and training future naval aviators. There's a lot in that first movie there's definitely some Hollywood for sure, but there's also a lot that's really pretty spot on. And so that movie is very influential for even the work I'm doing now with the idea of using debrief. And there's a line that I use in that movie that talks about the idea of a good fighter pilot is compelled to evaluate what's happened so he can apply what he's learned. And that's a line that comes directly out of the movie. So there's a lot of truth in that movie. So yeah, I would say for sure Top Gun. And that's the gold standard for me in movies.
Brilliant. The next question then, is there a person you'd recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Wow, folks that I think really value that idea of walking the line of living a life that is challenging to the point of first responders can gain something from it, but yet also creating a space that you can take lessons learned from. That person, I would, Admiral McRaven, I don't know if you're familiar with the work that he's doing now, but I think his military service, first of all, is, just so admirable, the work that he did in Special Operations Force, and his story is so powerful. But even beyond that, I think what's really impressive about Admiral McRaven is his ability to take those lessons learned and boil them down into a way that folks can actually learn from them. And, his books about, make your bed and some of these other lessons, very, very powerful stuff. So I would say Admiral McRaven would be one that has a lot to offer there for sure to your audience.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's been recommended a few times. Is this someone that you have any communication with at all?
No, I never met Admiral McRaven, but certainly I'm an admiral, a follower of his work for sure.
Brilliant. I'll have to reach out through the normal channels then. All right. Well, then the final question before we talk about your book and your presentations, what do you do to decompress?
Mm. So, so I am a car guy. I'm a fan of car guys, and I have uh, a C5 Corvette convertible. Then when I love to take drives with no particular place to go in that car, I don't get to do it as much as I would like, particularly in the winter months. But I will just go. My wife's like, I'm lost for hours kind of thing, because I'll just drive a road, and it's really nice to detach from how often do we get in cars that the first thing we do is we plug in our phone and we program the Apple CarPlay or whatever it is, and it immediately tells us this is the most direct route, this is the fastest route to get where we're going. And by driving just aimlessly, for lack of a better term, it really connects. It's an intentional detachment from, there's a plan, there's a place to be, there's a requirement to get to a certain place. That by taking a car drive that just goes nowhere, but just allows me to think and process, and maybe turn on some Van Halen music and just kind of enjoy the moment. I would say that's the biggest way that I find relaxation.
Beautiful. Well, your book is The Debrief Advantage. So talk to me about that, and then let's talk also about the opportunity to speak to organizations that are listening now.
Yeah. So the Debrief Advantage is the system that the book is based on. The name of the book is actually the Daily Debrief, which is a 5-step habit model. It's a 5-step habit that drives continuous improvement, and we're actually just developing here in the next 60. I'm working with the publisher right now to finish what's basically the new version of that book, where the original book was published in 2019, and now, because I've been speaking on it to organizations like first responders, organizations like business, organizations like athletics, colleges and universities, I've been speaking since 2019 on this topic of how do we use debrief to drive continuous improvement in ourselves and in our organizations. And so this new book incorporates a lot of those lessons learned from experiences of people that are using the model toward driving improvement in their life, whether it's professionally, whether it's personally, whether there's some stories in there about how they're using it in their marriage, how they're using it to become better parents. But the idea in its core is that there's a 5-step, 5-minute habit that we go through. And those 5 steps, very briefly, are gratitude, review goals, evaluate, anticipate, and take time for lessons learned. So it follows the acronym GREAT, but the book sets forth how we can use those 5 steps toward driving a life that is focused around continuous improvement.
Brilliant. My apologies for getting the book title wrong. I should have put my reading glasses on.
No, it's all good. Hey, you're not the first one to conflate those two. And that was, we intentionally titled the book differently. The book is essentially the habit model called the Daily Debrief. But it flows into, for organizations that really want to drive toward the culture of building a habit of continuous improvement across all of their employees and inside their teams. That model is called the Debrief Advantage. So I appreciate you mentioning both.
So where can people find both?
Yeah. So the easiest way to find it is at Debrief Advantage .com. That's the website that drives it. And for your listeners here, happy to provide, if they go to debriefadvantage.com/habit, that's where they're going to find everything they're going to need to get started on that 5-minute development habit that follows that great debrief model that we talked about. There's free resources on that website. There's all kind of information about how folks can embrace this idea of continuous improvement to improve their lives in substantial ways that'll move them forward. And for your listeners, that certainly applies for them as first responders, both on the job and when they go home. How do we develop into better humans through this idea of debrief? It's a simple 5-step model. And if they visit that website, they'll get all the information they need.
Brilliant. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation, some really powerful perspectives from the journey that you've had in the military and the commercial space. And, again, some of the takeaways on the leadership side, I think, are going to resonate deeply with people listening. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast.
Thank you so much, James. It's a real honor to speak with you and share some experiences with your listeners. And I really just want to say sincerely, I appreciate what you have done in the dedication of your life and the folks that your listeners to dedicate your life in the fire service and in first responders more broadly. You can't do that without committing to something greater than yourself. And I'm so admirable of that effort. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be with you today.